and certainly on another application in another form, your committee has granted a dispensation to a member to speak and vote as a resident, to give equality of representation with members who are board members of the girls' school, who of course don't have a disposable pecuniary interest. So there are two examples there that you want to take into account. Obviously, you need to look at the policy, you need to look at all the circumstances, and only grant a dispensation where you consider it appropriate in all the circumstances. Gentlemen, I'll probably leave it there.
Is it also fair to say that this is a general matter that affects everyone equally?
It is indeed, which is another reason.
Which is similar
why,
to the council tax,
yeah,
general legal disputes.
It's another reason why there's a good chance why there isn't a disposable pecuniary interest engaged in the first place.
Okay. Barbara, do you have
I
any?
don't have a problem with this at all. I think it's very similar to the one we've already granted to Deputy Mrs. Nash, and I think we should agree it.
I would agree, it's identical to that one.
Judith?
I've got the same problem as Michael, that I don't know how closely Defoe House is affected by
It's
the
at
development.
the other side of the pond. It's one way of looking at it.
I don't even know where the development is, so that probably doesn't help. If it is a tenuous connection and it's not really much of a pecuniary interest, I would think that it would be appropriate to grant the dispensation, but I am rather dependent on your knowledge, the committee members' knowledge of the location of Mr. Baslow's.
I think it's far enough away, it's not be a
do we know which side of the building?
It's on the northwest side of the estate.
Yes, but I did sort of have a quick look round. One side of the building looks over the girls' school, the other side doesn't, and I don't know which side his flat is.
Well, the
Not
flat
that it's
goes right
material.
through the building.
Oh, it looks at either side.
It goes
bedrooms
both
are
ways.
not
Yeah.
overlooking.
And the point is that Mrs. Nash lives in the same block,
Fine. Well,
within the
I
arts of Mr. Bastian.
don't have an issue, so can we agree that one
Yes.
in the circumstances? So, then we take the other three, which are in identical form, if I have read them correctly. Now, Controller and City Solicitor, could you brief us on the legal position with regards to these three identical ones?
Chairman, again, you need to have due regard to your current policy in determining this. You can only grant a dispensation if you consider it appropriate in the circumstance, and you've got to take into account all relevant matters.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I wonder if you could speak up a little bit, Michael. It's the
Sorry,
people.
I'll try and direct.
Well, I'm thinking of the people here as well. Sorry to interrupt.
Thank you.
Certainly, you must have due regard to your current policy, and effectively that means you must follow your current policy unless there are good reasons to depart from it. So if you wish to depart from your policy this afternoon, you would need to identify the good reasons. I would have to say that given there is still an ongoing debate and there are some matters coming back to committee in January, the fact that you happen to be on one side of the debate or another wouldn't, as a subcommittee, necessarily be a good reason for departing from the policy. So you would have to come up with some other reasons for departing from it, other than the fact that you simply don't agree it.
So the next time we meet, Chairman, is in January, I think. That's right.
That is right, yes.
Yeah, and so we would be considering.
Can you tell us what we would actually be considering at that meeting?
Well, if you recall at the last meeting, the current policy was voted upon and remains in force. However, the committee asked us to go away and come back to look again at the granting of more general dispensations, and indeed, as you know, one of the elected members has sent a proposal to the committee as a potential way forward. So that will be before you as well. But at the moment, your policy is as was agreed, and I know it was passed by a narrow margin, but nonetheless, the policy is as it was agreed at your meeting on 4th of October.
So, Chairman, would it be wrong if we considered this today and made a decision which was to go to the full committee in January to be confirmed or not. Would that be wrong?
I'm not convinced that it should be with a decision from here, but I do think that at that meeting we can request that in the interests of speed and clarity, that these dispensations, these other three, go to that meeting, the full meeting of that committee, and so they can be considered immediately after the decision on policy has been considered, so that we don't have to delay further by having another dispensations subcommittee formed. Because in considering these, I did not see any change in the dispensation requested from the last committee. Now, the last committee was unable to find within our policy substantial grounds to make a general dispensation available to those who requested them. So that we do need to have specific grounds on which to grant the dispensation. But the way they have been written in general terms doesn't give us anything to work on. Now, if they had been written in such a way as there were specific items that they needed to deal with, such as a girls' school, as we have just discussed, then we would have something specific to consider. And if a matter arose, and the matter still could arise between now and January the 24th, which is the date of the next meeting of the CoL Standards Committee, there is an urgency procedure on which the specific item can be notified to the town clerk in order to give a necessary dispensation within the current policy.
Because as you know, Chairman, we do have some difficulty in identifying what's coming towards us in time to consider whether we need to.
I think the only issue in my mind when that occurs is if in the unfortunate instance where something comes out not in the normal cycle, when we get 7 days notice, which I think is perfectly reasonable for the urgency to come through, but if something comes out later than that, and I know certainly when I'm a chairman, I do not like late items coming through, and if it's in the early part of the week, I insist it comes before the weekend so members can actually consider the matter. But particularly in planning, there are processes to know what's coming up on the agenda, because as soon as a planning application comes in, which is considerably before the time when a planning application is considered, there is notice that those applications are in and are going through the process within the planning department. And if you wanted to know when it was likely to come up, I'm sure a call either to the Chief Planning Officer or to the Chairman of the Planning and Transportation Committee would give you some sense of when they're coming, so that it can a necessary specific dispensation can be requested in due time.
I think the purpose of asking for dispensations in the form they have is to cover the fact that you could be away, you could miss something, and then you might want to speak. That's why they've worded it in this way, I think, to cover any eventuality, as it were.
I understand that, but the policy doesn't give us enough specificity to hang this particular request on.
No, maybe
and it is a conundrum. I agree. Judith.
Chair, I appreciate you might feel that it's better to refer it to the committee, but quite frankly, I can't see any grounds on which this committee, or indeed the Standards Committee, could possibly agree to this proposal. Because what in effect it's saying is that if, for example, Mr. Bostock and possibly his wife have an interest in a particular planning application, because they're going to make a lot of money out of it, now I'm using this purely hypothetically as an example, and nobody else in the ward benefits, then they would still be able to speak and vote, and that's got to be completely wrong. So whatever general dispensation the committee might want to be looking at, they can't possibly agree to something like that. It would undermine the integrity of the Corporation of London, and it would undermine democracy. I mean, it certainly wouldn't be in the interest of people living in the authorities area. So I can't really see there's any statutory ground made out, let alone anything else.
I'm not sure I agree with Judith's interpretation of that, but I've got two questions really. One is, does either the policy or the law take precedence, or have we to discuss it in the round? And secondly, if we put a time limit, say we said for 3 months, 6 months, whatever, on this dispensation, would that make it slightly less a general dispensation and therefore something that would allow us to do?
Control. I think legal advice is required.
Your current policy is clear. You will only grant the dispensation to vote in exceptional circumstances. So you need to identify, in order to follow your policy, you need to identify an exceptional circumstance.
Would a time limit on be an exceptional circumstance?
No, I can't see how that
Okay.
would be. That is a difficulty, and I think the other part of your question is our policy. I think is our interpretation of the law as it applies to this authority, and so they're actually, I think, would I be right in saying equal in precedence in that sense?
Well, your policy as it currently stands is designed to be within the law. Your policy has always got to be within the law. I don't think, although the policy, although not everybody agrees with this, I don't think there's any doubt that it is currently a lawful policy.
Just to go back to the point Judith raised, what we're doing, of course, is speaking for hundreds of other people. We're never speaking for ourselves.
Oh, quite. That is representative democracy.
So it's
Yes.
not as Judith said, we're trying to line our own pockets.
Yes, but the issue is, I think, that the law wasn't designed around the unique situation of the Corporation of London, and the issue to change the law is that those down the river have been somewhat distracted since June 2016 to do anything about this sort of little local problem.
But meanwhile, the people that I represent suffer for it because their views are not able to be
Well, I
heard.
think that the policy clearly states there are ways of getting views understood, and if a dispensation is asked, just like the one we just agreed, comes in to speak on a certain matter, but on a specific matter, I'm sure that will be granted with a certain degree of urgency. But the issue is that we do not have a reason to depart from policy on these dispensations in front of us. That is the key matter. Judith,
But
please.
I also I appreciate that obviously members want to represent their constituents. That's very, very natural and clearly in the interest of democracy. But there is an existing dispensation for members to speak on matters which affect the estate as a whole, which to me is the democratic right that members should have. And the problem arises when it affects either just the applicant and his wife, partner or whatever, and maybe a couple of other people, whereas the majority of the people on the estate are perhaps against what the member wants to put forward. The trouble with this wording is it allows that to happen, and clearly that is completely wrong, and that would would undermine the whole system, frankly, and it would not, as I say, it would not be in the interest of people living in the authorities area, or indeed on the estate itself that the members are representing. So I can't begin to think that would be acceptable.
I mean, the stumbling block seems to be this word general.
It is. It is.
If
And
it's
I would-
specific, it's okay.
If
If it's general,
That is my understanding of the policy.
And of course, it's not speaking; it's voting that matters.
It's voting.
Hands in the air that matter.
Well, I think that in January we are going to review, in the light of what happened at the last Standards committee meeting, and I certainly was vocal at that, saying, you know, I can see ways through the current conundrum, but it hadn't been adequately argued, certainly to my way of thinking, but I could see that there could be a way of adequately arguing it at the next committee. So it really depends for me on how those papers come through, because I don't think the whole committee is on one side of this argument or the other. I think they can be persuaded. But at the moment, these applications do not have enough in them to give us a reason under the law to grant the dispensation as I understand both the law and our policy. Is there anything you want to add, Michael, to that?
No, Chairman. I mean, I think obviously as a subcommittee you're in a difficult position. It is the ground committee that sets the policy, and your job is then to apply that policy, not slavishly, but to make exceptions where you consider it appropriate. The difficulty you've got, of course, is there are still divided views on the committee as to the policy, and it seems to me, although I'm obviously just here to advise you, that it is entirely legitimate for you to send it back up to the committee as a subcommittee for them to take the final decision on.
Well, I think certainly in the interests of getting this resolved, that would be the route forward to us. How do you feel about that, Barbara?
Well, I would like us to take a decision today and ask the committee to verify it or not.
Well, I think it's. I think. Well, you see.
Can we hear what the city solicitor thinks, Chairman, with respect to? If we took a decision today, it then went to the main committee in January for them to verify or not. What would be the position on that?
Well, I think it would just be, if that's conditional, then it would be exactly the same as simply deferring it.
Right. But it would show the people I represent the way we're going. At the moment, we're saying we're just going to push it down the line, and we know what happens with Brexit. That keeps on being pushed down the line. It doesn't. No, just a second. It just doesn't look as though we're doing anything to the people that I represent. It comes up all the time. It came up at our ward note a week ago, and people are very dissatisfied with it.
So, in that case, Barbara, what are the statutory grounds that you feel are available to grant
Well, I'm
the
just saying
dispensation?
that if we look at it on the face of it now, do we think it would be reasonable to, in effect, leave these people, who are all adults for God's sake, to decide for themselves on what they can speak and what they shouldn't speak on, which is what's happened since the year dot here, as far as I know. People make up their own minds. We could decide on the basis of what we think about that proposal, on whether we agree these proposals or not, and then it could go to, in January, to the committee, who would say either they agree with us or they don't agree with us.
But we have to be able to justify that within the law. Just saying that.
But the law says that it's a member's decision whether or not.
Sorry, is it not sufficient that on page 9, paragraph C1, considers that granting the dispensation is in the interests of persons living in the authority's area? Is that not sufficient?
The difficulty is you've got to explain how you're going to get away from your current policy. You can't just ignore your current policy.
But it also doesn't change the law, which says that it's a member's decision.
But Chairman, I've given my advice. I think it's a member's
You just
decision.
agree.
I think the point about the member's decision is that that is whether they've got an engaged DPI or not. The fact that we've been given these dispensations to consider indicates that those members feel they do have an engaged DPI. Therefore, we've got to apply our policy. Now, our policy is that if there are specific items that need to be discussed, then we can consider on the merits of those specific items the merits of the application. Now, we do not have here any specific items, so that the scenario that Judith has laid out is one of the possible scenarios that this, if we granted the dispensations now, could apply. And that would be quite plainly a breach.
But it wouldn't happen unless it was confirmed by the whole committee.
But I don't see that we have grounds that we can go back to the full committee within the current policy on general dispensations until the Grand Committee has reconsidered the policy. These fail for exactly the same reason they failed at the last time, because the policy hasn't changed and there are not enough statutory grounds in order to grant them. That's the issue. And I think that actually, if we defer it to the Grand Committee, we achieve the same aim that you are trying to achieve, which is to get this resolved as quickly as possible.
I'm just thinking that the way it looks to the people I represent is that we pushed it down.
And in the meantime, they wouldn't be able to vote on
well,
this
if
issue.
they might be, if they put in a specific
Yeah, but
one
without putting in a specific, they still wouldn't be able to vote.
No. But they would be, depending on what they've already been granted, and I can't remember.
Through the town clerk.
Through the town clerk to speak.
Yeah.
And personally, I feel that I'm more likely to be swayed by Mr. Moody in a planning transportation debate than I am necessarily needing to see which way he's voted or not. And certainly I've had the pleasure of listening to the Chief Elect on a number of occasions at planning and transportation, and they're always interesting interventions. Mary, do you have anything else you wish to
I don't think
say?
so. I mean, I share Barbara's. I mean, it is frustrating.
I share everybody's frustration, but where I think the frustration needs to be at the moment is where we are with the Grand Committee, not with this committee, because we have effectively, I think, been somewhat hamstrung by the fact that the policy hasn't changed.
Yeah.
And I don't think that changing the composition of a subcommittee allows us to make a different decision when it's already been considered by one subcommittee and the policy itself hasn't changed.
And it may not change in January.
Well, that I cannot legislate or advise about, but I've given my views as to where I think there is light at the or a chink in what's being considered there.
I think we put our hopes on the changing of the policy in the October meeting. And that didn't
January,
happen.
I think. Oh no,
Yeah,
you did, yes,
did.
in October.
And it didn't.
And that didn't
Yeah.
happen.
No.
And,
We just get our version.
Right,
yeah. Fine. So, with much regret, are we agreed that we need to send this to the Grand Committee to decide?
No other alternative.
Right. Town Clerk, do you have that carefully recorded?
I do, yeah.
Is there any other matters before this subcommittee?
I'm not aware in advance of any questions, Chair, unless any members of the panel wish to raise any at this stage. And
Question, no?
neither am I aware, Chair, of any other business that I can file.
Well, in which case, I would just like to thank all of those you the other side of the table for attending, and with that, I close this committee. There's something to
Yes.
I mean, I wasn't.
There was no president.
Yeah.
I looked very,
Yeah.
very carefully at council.
Yeah.
We were going to council, and then we saw that Adrian was stuck in there, and we had to do it.
Yeah.
It is very much on the lines too.
I don't know. There's sufficient precedent for you to say that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much.
More, thank you. Yeah. I'll see you in
January 24th. I hope you'll be there. Julie.
24th.
Yeah.
Remember the way to get here by then.
Sorry?
Remember the way to get here by then.
After Christmas and all of that, yeah.
Yes,
I'm going to hold on to those. Because I made all my notes on.
What can we do?
I don't know.
Don't have decisions.
You could resign at any point.
Didn't do any good, did we? Yeah. Yeah.
Do you want some help taking the kit back?
Yeah. Yeah. I know. It's unbelievable. Yeah. Unbelievable.